Hi, I wanted to give some of the simple, honest facts about the EU referendum before people decide how they're going to vote. So here are the main ones without any spin and hopefully in plain language. I'll talk a little bit about what will happen before the vote, some of the myths coming out of both campaigns, and what's likely to happen if we vote to remain or leave. My name's Greg Baker, and I run a company in Westminster called The Guide Consultancy. We give political advice to companies, charities, and other groups, and we work with all of the main parties. The important thing here is that we are completely impartial. So here goes. To start with some basic facts, the EU referendum will be held on Thursday, the 23rd of June. The question will be, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? British, Irish, Commonwealth, Maltese and Cypriot citizens over the age of 18 and who are resident in the UK, along with UK nationals living abroad who've been on the electoral register in the past 15 years, are all allowed to vote. If you want to take part in the referendum and you are not on the register, you have until midnight on Tuesday the 7th of June to submit an application for a vote. If you want a postal vote in the referendum, the deadline for applying is 5 p.m. on Wednesday the 8th of June. You don't have to register separately for the referendum, so if you're already on the electoral roll, you don't have to do anything else to register. If you're not already registered, go to gov.uk and fill in the form. It's very easy, only takes about 2 minutes. Even though it feels like the campaign's been going on for ages, the final part of the campaign only really started on Friday the 27th of May. This last part of the campaign is called PERDA, and this is when the publicly funded organisations, including the government, are not allowed to use taxpayers' money to try to influence you. So, if this is the final stage of the campaign, when will we have the result? Well, counts will get underway when polls close at 10 o'clock on Thursday night of the 23rd of June, and 382 local centres around the UK will declare their local results, so we'll have a good idea of how different parts of the UK have voted. These local results will then be collated at 12 regional centres, which will also declare the totals for each side. A chief counting officer will then announce the overall results at Manchester Town Hall as soon as it's ready. The referendum follows a renegotiation with Brussels at the end of last year, where the Prime Minister tried to get a new deal for the UK. In that renegotiation, the Prime Minister wanted to stop migrant workers sending child benefits home, though that was not agreed to. He also wanted a complete ban on welfare payments to EU migrants living here. Part of that was agreed to, so new arrivals won't get all of their benefits straight away, but they will do over time if they stay here. And Mr Cameron also said Britain will not join the euro, and he sought some protections for the City of London, and he also said that Britain will not be part of an ever closer union. Now, whether you support or oppose these ideas, they've not yet been put into European law, so they could still be adopted, changed or even ignored by Brussels after the referendum. There are two official campaigns in the referendum, Vote Leave and Britain Stronger in Europe. Both are cross-party, so they include politicians from all the main parties. Opinion polls are also currently split, and both Leave and Remain have been ahead in different polls. Opinion within different groups is also mixed. So, for example, in the business community, in very general terms, big company bosses are more likely to back Remain, and small company bosses are more likely to back Leave. Now, I used to work as a pollster, and my advice would be to ignore all of the polls on this one. Their accuracy will depend very heavily on turnout, and it's incredibly hard for pollsters to predict one-off events like a referendum. Before you vote, it's also worth a quick look, I think, at what our relationship with the EU is now. So, to start with, what's our financial relationship? According to the latest Treasury figures, the UK's net contribution for 2014-15 was £8.8 billion, which is roughly double what it was in 2009-10, and it works out about £125 for every man, woman and child in the country every year. How much control does the EU have over us? The House of Commons Library, which is an impartial body, says that between 15 and 50% of laws come from Brussels, depending on how you define it. It's hard to say exactly because some laws create more rules than others, so it depends how you measure it. How important is EU trade to us? We do more trade with the EU than any other area of the world, but that seems to be changing. So, for example, the EU accounted for 55% of our exports 10 years ago. Now it's only 44% and seems to be still falling. We also buy more from Europe than they do from us. Europe benefits to the tune of about £70 billion per year from us in trade with the UK, although that benefit is spread all around the EU. There have been a number of issues that have been highlighted in the campaigns so far, and the economy is one of the big ones. Now, this is where the spin and the myths start. To begin with, however they are presented by one campaign or another, all institutional forecasts say we'll be better off in 5 years' time than we are now. They just differ by how much, regardless of how we vote in the referendum. So, for example, when they say we will be poorer when we leave, what they actually mean is they think we would be better off, but not by quite as much. So, for example, the Confederation of British Industry commissioned one of the main accounting firms to test the economic impact of 3 different options coming out of the referendum. They predicted there would be 41% growth if we remain, 39% growth if we get a free trade deal, and 36% economic growth if we leave. Now, when you hear about economic predictions, I think the important thing to remember is that there are no objective predictions out there. You should ask which side the person making the prediction is on and work back from there. There's also a question about how good anyone can be at making economic predictions, even if they try. So, for example, last month's government borrowing figures from the Treasury said the Chancellor missed his borrowing target for 2015-16 by £1.8 billion. This month, the same figures were revised by the Treasury to say he actually missed it by £3.8 billion. That means that even when it tried to predict the economy 1 month ahead, the Treasury was wrong by more than 100%. I think that if they can't predict what's going to happen next month, they certainly can't in 15 years' time. Now, you might have noticed that lots of economists seem to be making the same predictions. In many cases, this is because they're using the same model. To use some fairly horrible economic jargon, this model is called the vector autoregression model. The name doesn't really matter, but because lots of people are using it, you would expect them to come up with roughly the same result. The model isn't perfect. For example, it didn't predict the problems with the euro or the financial crash. That's not to say it's necessarily wrong now, but just because it's being repeated lots of times by different people doesn't make it right either. Another big issue in the campaign is immigration. I think you can argue that large-scale immigration is a good or a bad thing, but that's not my aim here. There are some things we can be confident of. First, immigration is going up. The Office for National Statistics says an extra 330,000 people are coming in every year. That's equivalent to about the size of Coventry. And they say that that number rises to 474,000 people, which is the same as about Liverpool, if you include workers who are here temporarily. Whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, it is true that the government does not know exactly how many people are actually here. For example, the government says there are 64.5 million people living in the UK, but there are currently 68.4 million people registered with GPs. Similarly, over the last 5 years to June 2015, 1.2 million more national insurance numbers were issued to people than the government said had arrived. The last issue I wanted to mention is trade. Whatever happens in the referendum, we and the rest of the EU are still members of the World Trade Organization. Bound by its rules, the rest of the EU would not be able to increase tariffs above set limits on most things under World Trade Organization controls. It is true that the WTO would allow a 10% tariff on some things like cars, but the list of items is limited and, on average, countries that are not a member of the EU but that do trade with the EU face tariffs of about 3%. Perhaps most importantly, there is a difference between trade and trade deals. Trade deals are specific agreements made between countries or groups of countries. But we can trade with anyone, whether we are a member of the EU or not. That is just trade and does not require a specific deal for it to be allowed. For example, we do not have a trade deal with China or America, but we do lots of trade with both of them. So, what would happen if we vote to leave? If we do vote to leave, the answer to what will happen immediately is not much. If we vote to leave, under Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, we would have at least 2 years to negotiate exactly how we leave the European Union. And the government would not have to start that 2 years process straight away. In fact, they could wait for as long as they want, while they negotiate terms with the people that we will be leaving from the EU. During that time, Britain would continue to abide by EU treaties and laws, but not take part in some decision making. At the same time, if we leave, in some areas, the environment for example, where the UK is bound by other international agreements, much of the content of EU law would probably remain anyway. After our renegotiation, our relationship with the EU would have been decided by what our government can agree on our behalf with Brussels. And what would happen if we vote to remain? I can't offer an exact prediction of what would happen in either case, no one can. But it is important to bear in mind that in neither case would things be the same as they are now. For example, a paper called the 5 Presidents' Report was published by Brussels recently, and it sets out the plans for the EU between now and 2025. These plans include fiscal union, which means controlling countries' tax and spending powers, and creating a joint foreign policy, all to be achieved within 9 years at the most. The details of these plans are likely to be announced shortly after we voted in the referendum. And again, you may think these ideas are good or bad, but the important thing is the EU is changing. Now, I hope that's helpful, and I wanted to finish with a few thoughts of my own. First, both sides have been guilty of spin and exaggeration. I think the first campaign that treats voters like adults and gives them an honest appraisal of why they think we should vote one way or another is likely to win. Second, it's impossible to predict exactly what will happen after the vote. But whichever way we go, the world will keep spinning, and as all the economists predict, we're likely to see significant economic growth in the long term, whatever happens. There's just one more big issue I haven't talked about, which is sovereignty. This is our power as a country to act independently, and our power as the public to control politicians. Being a member of an international club like the European Union reduces our sovereignty. In return for giving up that power, we hope that France, Italy, Spain and the other European countries will make us stronger in the world and promote the UK's interests. But at the same time, if we vote to remain, we will be one of only 28 countries who get to decide the future of the UK, and we will have no control over most of the politicians who run the European Union. Perhaps the biggest decision for us on the 23rd of June will be whether we vote to remain under a government where we hope to have more power but to accept less control, or whether we vote to leave and take on the burden of our own government ourselves. Whether you think we should remain or leave, please do vote, and I hope this short talk's been helpful. Thanks very much.